someone whose judgment counts is Patrick Jeffson, Diana's private secretary between 1988 and 1996, who spent virtually every working day with the princess during those turbulent years. I've discussed these things many times with him. In his view, it's only possible to understand how Diana and Martin Bashir came together in fatal combination by looking at the extraordinary buildup to autumn 1995. Patrick told me, who could have predicted half the things that had happened in the preceding 5-10 years? It was hard work to decide what was real, what was unreal, what was believable, what was malicious. So it may seem naive of her, but in the context, it's not so far-fetched. It may seem strange that she could believe these things. But let me tell you, from my own experience, you didn't know what was coming from day to day. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. We are going to keep going in Dianarama today, and we are reading Chapter 2, and Chapter 2 is entitled How Much is True. What we're going to be focusing on today is what was Diana's mental state just prior to being approached by Martin Bashir, and what kind of world did she believe she was existing in. Diana thought that there were people who were after her, and she believed that not only was she in danger, but so were the people closest to her. And so when there were people around her who found themselves in accidents, she believed that those accidents had been orchestrated in order to basically show her and everybody else who was in her inner circle that they better mind their P's and Q's because she was not a safe person to know intimately. There is quite a bit of evidence, at least if you were in her position, to put together, and if not evidence, certainly circumstantial concerns that would lead a person in her position to believe that she truly was in danger. And she was just, frankly, ripe for the plucking when it comes to Martin Bashir. So let's find out where she was mentally. Remember, yesterday we were reading about Charles and his admission of having a relationship with Camilla, which was something that she'd known about for a really long time. And he was pushed into that admission mostly because Diana had had a book written that she had consented to by Andrew Morton. It was basically Diana in her own words. And it was lurid and it was shocking. And even though everybody wanted to believe initially that it was just a bunch of tabloid gossip cobbled together, those on the inside were confirming, yes, this is true. Yes, Charles does have a girlfriend named Camilla. And so after that admission on television to the public, even though it was kind of a paltry admission, not much was really gained by him coming out and saying what he did. He didn't, share revelations people hadn't known, but basically confirmed, yes, I have a very good friend named Camilla. And after he came out and said that, it kind of paved the way for Diana to come and have her own TV interview. It wasn't an answer to his interview, but it just made it easier and more possible to approach a royal to have their say on TV. But what we're focusing on today is what is Diana's mental state. The long road leading to Martin Bashir's Panorama interview, in turn to the horror of the accident in Paris in 1997, can be traced back to a far more prosaic setting, a junction on the A1-199 at Snaresbrook in the eastern suburbs of London on a rain-drenched night 8 years earlier. There, where Hermitage Walk joins the Woodford Road, a little after 10:15 p.m. on May 14, 1987, blue ambulance lights played over a small scene of tragedy. A red Ford Fiesta dented and slewed sideways in the road. An overturned Suzuki GS400 motorbike with the body of its helmeted passenger lying close by. The man appeared to be dead when I reached him. There was no movement, said a GP who had been driving past and stopped to help. The mundane horror of just another dreadful road accident was in this case far more. The man lying dead on the wet tarmac had been, in Princess Diana's words, the greatest love I've ever had. And because of that, she said, he had been murdered. The dead man was 39-year-old Barry Manaki, who only 9 months earlier had been Diana's police bodyguard. He was a plainclothes sergeant, married, good-looking in a TV detective kind of way, appointed in April 1985 to guard William and Harry as well as their mother, a job which involved shadowing the princess both in the UK and on tours to Italy, Australia, and America. At that point in time, the royal marriage was less than 5 years old. The evidence on the exact nature of Diana's relationship with her bodyguard is mixed, and it would be unfair to dwell on whether he offered merely emotional support or something more. Either way, in July 1986, Sergeant Manaki was abruptly switched to other duties after rumors of what was called over-familiar behavior began to spread from palace circles to Scotland Yard. It is Diana's response to Barry Manaky's death which matters. Andrew Morton, the journalist, she briefed secretly over a long period for his revelatory book published in June 1992, told me, when I was first involved with Diana back in 1991, the first question she asked me was Barry Manaky murdered by the security forces? You could say it was him that got me the gig. And she asked me that question because she'd had an affectionate relationship with him and she'd always had suspicions. It showed you what was brewing inside her mind on a daily basis. When in 2005, police came to investigate claims that the bodyguard had been done away with, perhaps by British Secret Services, to prevent a scandal emerging, they recorded that Diana many times had expressed her belief that this was murder. Detectives noted how Diana had reported her suspicions to Inspector Ken Worf, Sergeant Manaky's successor as bodyguard, to Paul Burrell, her butler, to two subsequent boyfriends, James Hewitt and Hasnat Khan. But most remarkably, we can hear Diana's own words. We can see her describing the relationship and outlining her belief that her former minder had been taken away. In late 1992, Diana had set out to improve her public speaking style, to do away with the slightly daffy voice of the Sloane Ranger. Diana decided that in future all public pronouncements would be delivered in a way that commanded respect and inspired belief. And so she hired an expert, a former Coronation Street actor turned voice coach called Peter Sedlin, part of whose method involved shooting clips of his pupils on the clunky video recorders available 30 years ago to watch and analyze later. He recommended that Diana choose subjects which were deeply personal, drawing out emotion and honesty. Recorded in the sitting room at Kensington Palace, Diana had no idea that what she put on tape would ever go beyond those walls. The material was indeed kept under lock and key within the palace, only reaching the public domain 7 years after Diana's death. It's remarkable to study the grainy footage. Diana relaxed, laughing occasionally, sharing what it is impossible to believe is anything other than the truth, at least as she saw it. I'll tell you one of the biggest crushes of my life, which I don't find easy to discuss. When I was 24 or 25, I fell deeply in love with someone who worked in this environment, and he was the greatest friend I've ever had. I was always wandering around trying to see him. I just, wore my heart on my sleeve, and I was only happy when he was around. It's like a little girl in front of him the whole time. It got so difficult. People got so jealous and bitchy in this house, and eventually he had to go. It was all found out, and he was chucked out, and then he was killed. Charles said to me, he was killed in a motorbike accident, and that was the biggest blow of my life, I must say. I think he was bumped off. I used to have really disturbing dreams about him, and he was very unhappy wherever he's gone to, and so I went and I found out where he was buried, and I went to put some flowers on his grave, and the day I did, the dream stopped. It's strange, isn't it? I should never have played with fire, and I did, and I got very burned. Diana did in fact question the terrifying prospect that Barry Manaky, the father of 2 young daughters, had been murdered, all because of her, and it is uncomfortable to imagine Diana's fear curdled with guilt. In June 1991, she asked Andrew Morton to discover what he could about the incident, and a short time later, the reporter relayed his finding. The motorbike had collided with a car being driven by trainee beauty therapist Nicola Chop, a 17-year-old who'd passed her driving test only 6 weeks earlier and caused the motorbike to swerve by performing a dangerous right turn. Admitting dangerous driving, she was fined £85 and surely sounded the least likely agent to be involved in a Secret Service-inspired assassination. Nonetheless, Morton said, I told Diana that, and why so the logic of it was there, and why so the evidence was there. She never really believed that. She always felt that some unseen forces had engineered that death. Barry Manaky's death remains just one of the extraordinary events in Diana's story which provide rich material for conspiracy theorists. In a panel to the notorious blinding white light said to have disoriented chauffeur Henry Paul the night of Diana's deadly crash, police investigators themselves suggested that the bright lights of a mystery vehicle could have been a factor in the collision in East London. Miss Chop at the wheel of the Ford Fiesta would say in 2003, I do believe that accidents can be arranged and that something suspicious happened that night. Barry Manaky's brother-in-law, Richard Emmons, spoke in 2017 about his continuing doubts. First, my brother-in-law had this accident, then Diana dies in a Paris car crash. But trying to get to the truth will probably be impossible. There, that lingering doubt, even from people who attended Sergeant Manaky's inquest, who will have studied the police reports line by line. So what did Diana truly believe? Someone whose judgment counts is Patrick Jeffson, Diana's private secretary between 1988 and 1996, who spent virtually every working day with the princess during those turbulent years. I've discussed these things many times with him. In his view, it's only possible to understand how Diana and Martin Bashir came together in fatal combination by looking at the extraordinary buildup to autumn 1995. Patrick told me, who could have predicted half the things that had happened in the preceding 5-10 years? It was hard work to decide what was real, what was unreal, what was believable, what was malicious. So it may seem naive of her, but in the context, it's not so far-fetched. It may seem strange that she could believe these things. But let me tell you, from my own experience, you didn't know what was coming from day to day. I've talked about these things, too, with Diana's brother, Charles Spencer. He told me, Diana didn't start off her adult life in an unhappy place, or one verging on paranoia. But I think repeated extraordinary revelations in public had left her very vulnerable and very suspicious. She was not academic, but she had a very clever mind, and she had a very high emotional intelligence. And I think it really played on that clever, alert mind. There was a feeling among all of us who cared for and loved Diana that she was very beleaguered and was up against a big opponent, and we felt beholden to help. Another person Diana confided in at this time was the then 38-year-old Daily Mail journalist Richard Kay, who told me, I knew her socially as a friend, as well as being a journalist. This idea that she was some sort of empty-headed young woman who couldn't string two words together was simply not the princess I knew. She was someone who was witty, quite well-read. Certainly she was very up with current affairs. He says Diana's belief that she was a surveillance target, whether true or not, was entirely genuine. Diana felt that she was being spied on, watched, recorded, observed by shadowy people. She didn't trust the enemy, as she called them, the courtiers who served Prince Charles, because she felt that they were taking notes on who she saw, what she did. She felt at times quite alone, that she was one woman against the system, which in many ways she was. It is hard to imagine that a shiver did not run down Diana's spine when she first heard the news of Maniki's death in May 1987. She told Peter Sedlin that it was Prince Charles himself who passed on the news as they were preparing to board a royal flight to the south of France, their destination, the Cannes Film Festival. Charles just dumped it on me like that, and I wasn't able to do anything. I just sat there all day, going through this huge high-profile visit to Cannes, just devastated. 20 miles along the coast from Cannes is Monaco, which Diana had visited 5 years earlier in an equally troubled frame of mind. The funeral of Princess Grace of Monaco took place on September 18, 1982. She, having died from head injuries after losing control of the rover she was driving, plunging from a winding mountain road. Diana's attendance at the funeral was evidence of a long fascination with the former Hollywood star Grace Kelly, a figure whom she regarded as something of a kindred spirit. Diana recounted to Andrew Morton how Grace had taken her discreetly aside at a London palace reception, shortly before the 1981 royal wedding, to offer private words of solace to the nervous young princess-to-be. Diana told Morton, I learned a lesson that night. I remember meeting Princess Grace and how wonderful and serene she was. But there was troubled waters under her. I saw that. By the time of that shared confidence with Morton in 1992, the marriage of Grace and her husband, Prince Rainier of Monaco, had been picked over by biographers, revealing infidelity and intrigue remarkably similar to Diana's own experience. And so the car crash. Do princesses who step out of line need to look out for not just the safety of discarded lovers, but indeed their own? So much of Diana's story sounds improbable that it is no great leap at all from reality to fantasy. The boundary between the two is gossamer thin. So what was it like for the person living inside this chamber of smoke and mirrors when, for them, deciding between fact and fancy might literally mean life or death? Even if the deaths of Barry Manaki and Princess Grace spelled only imagined menace, there was plenty of the real thing headed Diana's way. In August 1992, shortly before her public speaking lessons with Peter Sedlin, with the aftershock of Andrew Morton's book still rippling through the country 6 weeks after publication, Diana arrived at Balmoral, Queen Victoria's turreted Highland retreat, for what must have been the least jolly getaway it is possible to imagine. Balmoral was the venue for an annual invasion by the entire royal family, a private palace, in the pre-internet era a remarkably insulated place, creating conditions eerily similar to a modern-day reality TV compound where imported hatreds are carefully nurtured into bloom. 30 years ago, with no newspapers available on mobiles or iPads, the mood for the day ahead at Balmoral, certainly the atmosphere over breakfast, was determined by the arrival of the London newspapers, flown first to Aberdeen, and then driven the 50 miles along forest roads. On Monday, August 24th, 1992, in thick letters 3 inches high, the Sun headline read simply, "My life is torture." Diana's words, but much more worryingly, Diana's words as captured in a hacked phone conversation between the princess and boyfriend James Gilby, which had actually taken place long before, on New Year's Eve 1989. This was what was gone down in history as Squidgygate, so called because Gilby used his pet name for the princess, Squidgy, 14 times during the call. The evidence shows that the call took place around 7 p.m. on December 31st. Diana speaking on a landline, miserable and alone in her bedroom at Sandringham. Gilby on a mobile inside his parked car in a lay-by in North Oxfordshire some 150 miles away. The language is occasionally salty, sometimes fruity, as the chat meanders for 23 minutes across subjects ranging from their next dinner date to how Jimmy Savile, then a royal favorite, has been called on to offer tips on handling the media. For just a flavor of hinted-at hanky-panky of how ghastly it is to be married to Prince Charles. "He makes my life real torture. I've decided, bloody hell, the things I've done for this fucking family." "I haven't played with myself for a full 48 hours. Not for a full 48 hours. "I don't want to get pregnant." "Darling, that's not going to happen. All right?" "Yeah." "Don't think like that. It's not going to happen, darling. You won't get pregnant." Anybody who had known the routine fraughtness of being a guest in the in-laws can imagine how the leaking of this conversation played over breakfast at Balmoral on this and succeeding days. The Sun reveled in its exclusive, as every other paper, red top and posh alike, picked over the scraps. For Diana, it was beyond cringe-making, she being reduced to relying on Patrick Jeffson, on holiday 700 miles away in Devon, to buy an armful of newspapers the moment they arrived at his local newsagent at 6 a.m. to brief Diana before her descent to breakfast. I stood in a call box outside the newsagent's, reading to the princess as calmly as I could the printed transcript of her intimate conversations with James Gilby and the damning chorus of comments that accompanied it. Diana would shortly be able to relieve her private secretary of that task. The Sun made audio of the entire call available to readers who dialed a premium number at 36 pence a minute. Roughly 120,000 people did within hours. Patrick told me it was intended to diminish her in the public's eye, to embarrass her. But curiously, it had the opposite effect. She came across as vulnerable, trying her best in a loveless marriage, finding some consolation somewhere. It actually, in a curious way, made her look more human, approachable, lovable, and forgivable. She was quite pragmatic about it. You could dial a number and listen to it. So I did dial the number, just to satisfy myself that it really was her. And I told her about it later, and she said, "Well, I hope you use the office phone. I wouldn't want you to have to pay the charge." Extraordinary as it may sound, the eruption of Squidgygate may have been, for Diana, a relief. The Sun had received a taped copy of the phone call in January 1990, within 10 days of its having been made, and hours later confronted Gilby outside his home in London's Lennox Gardens. The newspapermen announced their discovery before Gilby fled to share the terrible news with Diana herself. But then nothing appeared in print for a tortuously long time. To finally see her words in the newspaper, then hear her own voice in radio and television reports, was a horror Diana had anticipated for more than 2 years. The Sun had held back so long from going to print, not because they doubted the veracity of the tape, but because even the rhino-hided bosses of what was then the country's top-selling paper knew how damaging publication would prove for the princess, for the monarchy as a whole. With the appearance of Andrew Morton's book, revealing the emotional knife-fighting that had been going on for years, the bar for acceptable outrage had been dropped by several notches. Squidgy could debut. There was no certainty even today whether Squidgygate was part of a plot pulled together by spooks or a crazy bit of happenstance unkindly targeting a very unlucky princess. When technical experts listened to the tape, they immediately pointed to electronic pulses which seemed to say it could not have been recorded live, as the conversation occurred, rather that it must have been captured from Diana's landline and then rebroadcast. Why? In the hope that some member of the public equipped with the correct scanning device would tune in to the couple's chat and take it to the papers? But surely that sounded fantastical, a carefully engineered plot which still depended entirely on luck to be carried through. And who could be behind it? To first tap one of Sandringham's phones and then cleverly reintroduce the audio into the broadcast sphere suggested skill and resources only available to MI5. Or more likely, the UK intelligence gathering wizards at GCHQ. The informant who brought the tape to the Sun seemed a model of rectitude. 70-year-old retired TSB bank manager Cyril Renan freely volunteered that his hobby was to listen to random phone calls on a 900-pound receiving device in his home in Abingdon, close to where Gilby had been at the time of the conversation. Mr. Renan told his local newspaper, the Oxford Mail, that no, he didn't just snoop out of nosiness. He listened to phone calls hoping that he could pick up insider gossip from people in the horse racing world, which he would then use as tips for betting. To add to the confusion, Mr. Renan said he had not happened upon the call at the time it was made, on New Year's Eve 1989, but on January 4th, 1990. Surely that was evidence for the rebroadcast theory, and an indication of something very sophisticated, very murky going on. But how he was able to seize on the very quiet back and forth between Diana and Gilby amid the thousands of calls floating through the airwaves remains a puzzle to this day. Mr. Renan died, age 82, in 2004. The story which brought toe-curling mortification for Diana also troubled the government. Once the official spy agencies began to fall under suspicion, the then Home Secretary, Kenneth Clark, was forced to publicly deny any suggestion that MI5 or GCHQ had been involved. But if this official denial was to be believed, then it surely left only possibilities which were even more chilling than surveillance by the state. Surveillance by agents with all the expertise and resources of the state, but with their own rogue agenda. And so for Diana, here was the worst of all possible worlds. Not only were her private conversations being bugged by persons unknown, but they would be released to the world in a way and at a time to cause her maximum damage. And just as in the case of Barry Manaki, Diana had not got a clue where the truth lay. She was sure of only one thing, and she would go to tell Martin Bashir in November 1995 in her Panorama interview. Bashir, have you any idea how this conversation came to be published in the national press?
No, but it was done to harm me in a serious manner, and that was the first time I'd experienced what it was like to be outside the net, so to speak, to not be in the family.
In Diana's analysis, August 1992 marked the first instance where the dark forces ranged against her decided to demonstrate their awesome power. While she had run a homespun operation, with a friend literally ferrying the tapes of her anguish by bicycle to Andrew Morton, here was evidence of magisterial technical competence as well as terrifying audacity. In deciding to trash Diana so publicly, whoever was calling the shots was even prepared to risk collateral damage to the Windsor brand, so long as this late recruit was squashed like a bug. But at least the enemy seemed to have declared himself. Imagine how even that decree of certainty was shaken when, a little over 4 months later, Diana's attempt to build a cogent narrative was crushed instantly. The next chapter goes on to discuss that while Diana was certain that somebody was after her and had released the phone calls to embarrass her and to get her out of the family and to squash her like a bug, all of that comes tumbling down when later a call between Charles and Camilla is then leaked. So she can't be the sole object of the palace's ire because Charles, the one she thought was after her, literally just had his own embarrassing tape released. So what's the deal here? Like, why are all these tapes being released? It would have been so easy to decide that Charles was your enemy because this looks exactly like something an enemy would do. And now he's the subject of somebody else's ire? Now tapes are being released of him? How'd that happen, you know? So it just makes life so confusing for her. I have to say that if I were her, I would feel certain beyond a shadow of a doubt that people were after me. And it wouldn't really matter what anybody said because I'd be the one living in this confusing world. And I really think that Patrick Jeffson is the one who tells the truth when he said that maybe people can say she was naive or conspiratorially minded, but when you lived in a world where when up was down, black was white, day is night, how are you supposed to know what is conspiracy and what isn't? You can't use the regular powers of logic because logic doesn't seem to hold in this environment that she lives in. So tomorrow we're going to be reading 2 chapters. We're going to be reading the chapter about when Charles's tape comes out, and then we're going to get into the meat of who was Martin Bashir and why should he not have been trusted by the BBC as a whole. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the things he did previous to the Diana interview that should have completely exposed the kind of person he was, and he should have been dismissed multiple times on other counts before he ever even got to Diana. So this isn't like a case of like, oh man, we thought he was a great guy. You guys had warnings, but you didn't choose to take it. All right, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I will see you guys again soon tomorrow for the next 2 chapters. And Megan's show is coming up, so look for my review of her holiday episode this week. All right, I'll see you then. Bye.